Hi, good evening everyone, and welcome to Sotheby's in London. We are sitting in the preview of our photographs exhibition. Our auction is this Thursday here in London, and we are here to have a panel discussion on collecting photography. In collaboration with our partners and friends at CitiPrivate Bank, this is part of their program Art Beyond Borders. So before I present the panel, and before we get into the discussion, the MD of CitiPrivate Bank, Mr. Anthony Cockett, will say a few words first about their program.
Thank you, Brandy. So as Brandy said, my name's Anthony Cockett, Managing Director of CitiPrivate Bank in London, and it's our great pleasure tonight to work in collaboration with Sotheby's. It's worth just saying a few words about our partnership with Sotheby's and why we think there's a particularly good fit. And both of our clients, I think, we could describe as worldly and wealthy. Both of us have extensive international network, and I think we approach the work that we do for our clients with an international perspective as well. And lastly, our clients, rather like our clients, a lot of us bring a sort of personal passion to the art world as well as a professional passion with the services that we provide. So CitiPrivate Bank actually has an art advisory services. It was set up in 1979, and it's really helped a lot of our clients establish art collections, grow them, protect them, and even finance them. So if anyone would like to talk about the services that we have there, do catch me after this evening or one of my colleagues. So Art Beyond Borders is a program of events with film and written content that explores art from fresh perspectives around the world. It sees art really as an exploration of imagination with the additional ambition of the artists that bring innovation and experimentation to their world. As Picasso said, you learn the rules like a pro and then you break them like an artist. So there's a film series that goes with Art Beyond Borders, and that analyses some of the famous artworks around the world. The first one is Paul Gauguin's Woman Holding a Fruit, which is based in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. And there's a film both on the Sotheby's website and the CitiPrivate Bank website that just explores and celebrates that picture, and there'll be other ones part of that series along the way. So in addition to this event in London, which is our first event in London in this series, we recently held a similar event in Dubai, and as with City Group and Sotheby's on this sort of global basis, we'll be going down to Rio, moving up to Buenos Aires, we'll be going to Mexico City, and then on from there. So really just underlying the international outlook that we bring to a lot of the work. So on to tonight. In addition to the exhibition of photos you see from Sotheby's forthcoming auction, we have this amazing panel tonight. We've been particularly lucky to secure the panellists here tonight because of Photo London that's coming up on Thursday. It's described as the best photography event in the UK. We'll see after tonight. But for those that want to see that, it's Thursday, featuring all of our panellists, of course, at Somerset House. That's enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Brandy and for what promises to be a fantastic evening tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Anthony. So I'm Brandy Estes. I'm the head of photographs here at Sotheby's in London. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of collecting photography, I think it's important to have each of the panelists explain what they do, what they're working on now, why this week coming up is so important and such a gift to all of us here, whether you're a seasoned collector or just starting out. So I'll briefly introduce you all, and then please discuss what you're up to. So Michael Benson on my left, immediate left, who is the co-founding director of Photo London, the fair that's happening this week. Brett Rogers, who is the director of the Photographers Gallery, just around the corner, in my second home. Giles Huxley-Parkour, who is the director of one of my favorite photography galleries here in London. and Carrie Scott, who I'm a huge fan of, who is an art historian and curator with a particular interest and passion in photographs, as we all share. So, Michael, do you want to start off and tell us what you're up to at the fair this week?
I wish I knew, Brandy. Well, basically, this is all my fault. We wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't from the fact we started Photo London 5 years ago. I'm still shocked to even think it was 5 years ago. It feels like 5 minutes ago. And when we started at Somerset House, before we started at Somerset House in 2015, I remember going around all over the world trying to persuade people to come to London, and they were a little bit skeptical. They weren't sure there was any kind of market here. But the first edition of Somerset House in 2015, we had 70 galleries, and we also, I'm showing you this picture of the courtyard at Somerset House because it's one of the most beautiful public spaces in London. And we wanted, if you know either myself or my co-director Carrie, but you know that we abhor empty spaces. So even in the first year when we only had 70 galleries, we could easily fit them in the house. We still made this exhibition in the courtyard, which was a light installation by the photography artist Rutlis Luxemburg. However, we were so popular after the first edition, we were already turning people away, that we decided that we'd have to build a tent, or we call it pavilion, in the courtyard. And we were able to move from 70 to around 100 galleries. But the demand kept coming. I mean, we have maybe 3 applications for each place at the fair. So and I have to say that Somerset House have been a dream. They sit on a grade 1 listed building, and they're not wild about the idea of putting a tent in their courtyard, but they've supported us. And so the courtyard now tent has grown bigger. 2017 it got even bigger still, and last year in 2018 was our biggest courtyard pavilion yet, and that's where it stayed. Now the pavilion itself offers us an interesting opportunity. Because as well as housing this year 114 galleries in Somerset House and around and through the pavilion, it also offers an interesting space for art. And Photo London, as well as being this great combination, a great meeting point of galleries from all over the world, bringing wonderful photography, is also very well known for its public program, which is supported by a lady called Maya Hoffman, who some of you may know. Maya has given us the impetus to develop this public program into something really special. And so one of the things we've done is to create a series of commissions on the walls or the sides of the courtyard pavilion. And our courtyard pavilion this year takes the theme of women in photography. We're rather proud of the numbers of women that are involved in Photo London. Our exhibitors, curators, and artists total about 40% of those taking part in the fair. And just to give you a comparator, that's sort of most art fairs hover around the 27% mark. So we feel as if we're doing quite well. So it was quite appropriate for our 5th birthday to be doing a pavilion installation on the theme of women in photography. This is by Susan Maesaias. This one is by Mary McCartney. And this is by a young photographer called Rachel Louise Brown, who happens also to be the photography editor of Harper's Bazaar. So, as well as our courtyard pavilion installations, we also do a public program. Every year we celebrate a particular photographer with the title of Master of Photography. And so we'll do a huge show during the course of the fair this year of work by Stephen Shaw, who's this year's Master of Photography. The work that Stephen's bringing to London is work made since his MoMA retrospective in 2017, and also a lovely series of black and white photography shot on a single day in 1969. We'll also, because we have a lot of exhibition spaces, we're going to run a show on the great pioneering photographer Roger Fenton. Moving on, we're also doing something with Howard Greenberg Gallery from New York on Vivian Maier. I think it's one of the very few shows that have been on Vivian Maier's work in London, so I'm particularly proud that we're bringing that here today, this week rather. The great street photographer Eamon Doyle from Ireland is doing a music and sound installation with us. Josh Hanna from the New York Times. We felt that it was an important moment to celebrate photojournalism. Photojournalism gets a slightly bad rap from all kinds of political figures these days, and we thought we should be redressing the balance slightly. So we're working with a New York Times Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, Josh Hanna, to make a series on climate change, which I think is going to be a stunning addition to the fair. We use every single additional space we can in Somerset House, including this space, which is in the catacombs of the building, called the Dead House. It's where the palace used to bury their servants. And we've turned it into a space for art. There's an online platform called Art Tuner, who are hanging work there, which kind of challenges the boundaries between photography and other art forms, particularly painting. So these 4 artists will be taking part in that. And also, and finally, on the terrace, the river terrace at Somerset House, Gavin Turk, who most of you will probably know as a sculptor, has created this egg, which has been sitting there since Easter. And Gavin's central contention is that we now understand art through photography. And so not only are what he's now done is actually ask people to submit their egg photographs, many thousands of which will be projected in the Great Arch Hall at Somerset House, and a small jury of Gavin himself, Martin Parr, and Sarah Lucas will decide which is the best egg photograph in London. So that's something we'll be looking forward to later in the week. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Over to you, Brett. Brett Rogers, the director of the Photographers Gallery.
Thank you, Brandy. Actually, as Brandy alluded, the gallery is located just near Liberty's, around the corner, so very accessible to Sotheby's and to all the things in the West End. And what we love is that we're the only public space in this sort of area around here. And we were founded 50 years ago in 1971 by Sue Davies, who's still alive, and all the 3 previous founding directors are all alive at the moment, which is a wonderful thing about the Photographers Gallery. It's a very living institution. Through the period of those 5 decades that we've existed, we've introduced most of the major names to London, from Walker Evans and Lartigue in the 70s. We were the first gallery to show those people, especially and all the big Magnum names, to more recently when, with the Deutsche Börse Photography Prize, we introduced people such as Gursky, Jürgen Teller, Rineke Dextra, and many other names that are now household names that are going to be showing at Photo London. So this is where we first existed, in Great Newport Street, just near Leicester Square Tube, from 1971 till I moved the gallery in 2005. And now we have a handsome new space designed by Irish architects O'Donnell and Toomey, just near Liberty's off Oxford Circus. And that's a 6-story building where we can do our program and show exhibitions in state-of-the-art climate-controlled galleries. This is Gregory Crewdson, who we showed the year before last, his first public exhibition in London. This is an exhibition about cross-dressing that was really from one private collector, and it's fascinating for you all to know that you can collect material like this. He spent 10 years collecting images from the 19th century to the present day of people cross-dressing. Sebastian Lifshitz. This is Alex Prager, who was our big show for last summer. And of course, as well as these shows, a very, very important part of what we do, which is in our DNA, is education, because we exist really to promote an understanding and appreciation of photography in all its forms. So we do that not just through exhibitions, but through courses, workshops, talks, and events. So anything you want to hear or learn about photography, you can find at the Photographers Gallery if you attend something there, or through visiting our bookshop. And of course, finally, this is Tish Merther of Social Documentary Photography we showed last year. Tish died very early. We brought her work to international recognition through this pioneering show last year. But finally, we also have, since we were formed in the early 70s, a print sales gallery selling commercially with the work of young photographers. And this is Vasantha Jürgen Nathan, who's done a beautiful series based around the Ramayana. And the purpose of print sales is really to introduce the idea of collecting to a new audience. And that's most probably why I've been invited to sit up here tonight. So whilst it's not the core of our business, it's been a very important part of the Photographers Gallery. And I'm always pleased to be reminded by Sue Davies, the founding director, that this happened really by mistake, because one of the people from the bookshop went to see Andy Warhol in his studio in 1974 and came back with a pile of Polaroids that they'd bought from Andy, and we had nowhere to sell them. So they set up a little part in the back of the gallery, and that's how print sales began in 1974. And I was very pleased to see in the Diane Arbus show that's just finished at the Hayward that the Diane Arbus works were bought from the Photographers Gallery in 1974. So print sales has been in our DNA since then. And so just finally, a work by Jess Fairbrother, which is also present, just come down from a show in print sales. I think that's all.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you very much. Giles Huxley-Parlour.
Hi. So my name is Giles Huxley-Parlour. I own the Huxley-Parkour Gallery. We're based just on Swallow Street, just by Piccadilly. I don't know if you guys have oysters at Bentley's, which is that famous restaurant sometimes, but if you do, you can just sort of fall left slightly and find us tucked away on the end there. We've been there for about 10 years, and we have a sort of broad remit with our program, but it's also quite focused. We just try to work with photographers who have made or who are making some sort of contribution to the history of photography, the history of art. So that's our sort of basic premise, and if we think they can tick that box, then they can be considered for the program. So we have a broad program. We work with contemporary fine art photography, photojournalism, even 19th century photography. And it's a celebration of the medium, really. That's the idea. What does Photo London Week mean to us? Well, it's fantastic that it exists at all, I think, is the main thing. And when we first started working with photography as a gallery 12, 15 years ago, we would work with a lot of American dealers and say, you know what, we're selling photographs in London. And they couldn't believe it. And they were completely incredulous. They didn't want to work with us. They thought there was no point sending photographs to a gallery in London because there was no market there. Well, I think Michael and you guys and Brandy and everybody here has proved that completely wrong. So that's what Photo London means to me. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Carrie, Scott.
I mean, impossible acts to follow. Thanks so much for putting me last. So I started my company about 10 years ago, just a little bit over 10 years ago, and I was working for a big gallery in New York, and the world was falling apart, as you all can remember. It was 2008, and that was not a good moment to be an art dealer. And I sort of felt that there must be some better way to do the art business and not have crazy overheads of a gallery and not have to feel the confines of working with the same 12 artists in the same space over and over and over. I was young and naive, and somehow I have stayed alive, and am very much this week riding on the coattails of Michael's success. And I don't mind admitting that because I absolutely am. When Photo London first came on the scene, it was profound and exciting, and really did put London on the map with regards to photography. And that had been coming from a commercial standpoint because we had the foundations that Brett had put in place. And I recognized an opportunity to do something in a space which is literally 150 yards away from Somerset House, but not actually there. And again, was looking at what happens, when Frieze got going, satellite fairs pop up all around. And I sort of hoped I could do something like that. So last year I did an exhibition that had 470 photographs in it, and I swore I would never do it again. And this year I have an exhibition of an incredible master of photography who has sadly been sort of sidelined. And this week we have a documentary on his life premiering at Curzon on Wednesday night, and then we have that screening multiple times throughout the week. And then I'm opening his first UK show of, we'll have 70 photographs that date from 1950 through to 1970. And I don't have a slide, but I do have a catalog if anyone wants to look at it. But I was installing today, so I didn't get anything to you at all.
Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
I think it's so important. All of us here are very familiar with the contemporary market and the contemporary world, and how you have institutions and patron programs, and the galleries are big names and people know dealers. And I just, when we were thinking about doing this panel discussion, I really wanted to introduce the photo side of that and to make you all aware that we exist in a very similar ecosystem as the contemporary world. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with some or all of the panelists here, but if you're not, I hope you do. After the talk, continue to stay in touch with everyone, because it's all about when you're collecting anything, whether it's a coin, it's a Chinese jug, we've got a lot upstairs, or a photograph, it's so important to have those relationships and with so many different people, and to build that knowledge through the different people who are in that ecosystem. So, Brett spoke very at length about the Photographers Gallery, which is so, has been so central to the photography market, and how we understand in the UK photography, not just collecting it, although you have a wonderful print space, but how you view it, how you consume it, how you engage with it. And your patrons program is, just as good as the Tates or the Serpentines. And again, if you're starting out, or if you're a big collector of photography, I would encourage you to get involved with the Patrons program, because as you say, you put on a lot of events and artist studio visits, and that's such a great way if you're trying to work out where to collect, what to collect. That's a wonderful way to support artists and discover things and educate yourself in the process. So with that in mind, I'd love us all to keep in our mind, you know, how do we collect photographs? A lot of people in this room or in this city will have contemporary collections or will have other works of art. And the photography market is very young compared to most other categories of collecting in the art world. And I think because it's so young, if we say that it really started in the late 70s, early 80s, this market, this commercialization of selling a photograph as a collectible that you're going to frame and put on the wall, I'd love to just start off, you know, what were the trends and where are we seeing things now? How have they moved swiftly from the 80s to now? And I suppose, Giles, as a gallerist, you're best placed to discuss that first.
Well, I've come to it all a little bit late, but in a way, my existence is an example of how the photography market has expanded. I think back in the 60s and 70s, it was a kind of hyper-connoisseurial, tiny business where mostly operated out of book dealers. So there were the occasional gallery that specialized in photography, but it was a minuscule market. And as we all know, you know, vintage prints were thrown away because nobody could be bothered to store them. But since then, it's grown exponentially. And I think probably since about 2000, certainly, it's kind of hit the big time. And it's gone from being that niche to being something that if you're new to collecting art, you're very likely to think about buying a photograph, just as you might well think about buying a painting or a sculpture. This is fantastic. I think broadly it's fantastic. In terms of what people like to buy, I think there's several answers. Firstly, this expansion in the market has brought attention to all sorts of different types of print and photography that I think would have been ignored previously. And actually just looking around, any auction or Photo London, you're going to go and see the most amazing array of imagery that's made with a camera. It's fantastic. And that's not just because of the photo market, of course. It's because photography has become ever more pervasive in our daily lives, and Instagram being the obvious example. But since the internet, I think photography has become even more of a visual currency than it ever was, and that has coincided with the expansion of the market. So I think there's no coincidence. In terms of trends, well, my main answer is rather a boring one, actually, which is that actually the main trend that I see in the gallery over and over again is people returning to the classics, the great big names of photographic history. Those are still the core of our business, and in some ways, despite our best efforts, we try obviously to introduce contemporary photography and all sorts of innovative stuff. But for every one contemporary photograph we sell, we'll probably sell 10 or 15 classic black and white mid-century photographs by Cartier-Bresson or whoever it might be, which is fantastic. And actually looking around this auction here, you can see that there's a solid core of that. So that's been a real solid part of the market. That's there as a sort of certainty in a way. And then the contemporary sort of trends sort of ebb and flow a bit depending on photographers and fashion. I think an obvious one to bring up in recent years is, of course, the Me Too movement, which has slightly affected the photography market, much of which has, of course, been sort of centered around the male gaze historically. So that's something where galleries and fairs and everything are shifting their attention quite rightly to other types of picture. Perhaps with this great expansion of interest in photography and interest in different types of photography and photographers, perhaps the one thing that has slightly suffered, you could argue, is the sort of connoisseurship about vintage prints, old prints, particularly 19th century, which I think is having a very tough time generally. Wrongly, because it's amazing. You should all go and look at 19th century photography. It's incredible and it's ridiculously cheap. That, I think, is the one area that has slightly suffered in our business, and I wish we had slightly more people coming into the gallery interested in the object as much as the image, and that's, I think, all of our jobs is to try and educate people about this quality of the object.
Definitely, and I think, Michael, for you, as part of your remit as a director of the fair, is to ensure that all of the galleries who are participating in Photo London are bringing that type of quality material, that it's not just all contemporary pigment prints, inkjet prints, that there is this variety that you can offer clients of these beautiful vintage prints and...
Absolutely, and actually, interestingly, and I do understand your point about 19th century, but one of the strongest performing parts of the fair is the 19th century, other 19th century dealers, which is fascinating to me. And we've always wanted, you're completely right, we've always wanted to be as broad as we possibly can. So great 19th century work. We also have a discovery section in the fair, which is for young galleries between 1 and 5 years old, who are bringing really exciting, interesting, and very, very affordable photography experiments with photography. One of our galleries, we've been having an interesting problem today because they're suspending photographs in tanks of rather flammable liquid. So that's always good fun. So yes, and of course we have the classics. But I mean, part of our remit is to make sure that the quality of what we bring, or what our galleries bring, is as high as possible. And we took a decision this year to really, really go for that in a big way. We have a curatorial committee which takes its job very seriously. They do a very serious vetting before the fair opens. And so we work very hard on quality. And we thought this year that actually, because we were being so insistent about quality, the numbers of galleries participating would go down. We're quite happy to do that. But actually they didn't. We have more galleries this year than we've ever had before. So something interesting has happened, and I'm not quite sure what, to be quite honest with you, but we have a very strong fair this year.
Wonderful. And I know, Brett, you do the most fantastic tours with the Photographers Gallery and the patrons groups. And I know that every year you're doing tours at the fair and you're taking people around. And do you have highlights coming up? Because I know you've had a sneak peek of what's coming up.
There's always highlights there, but we're very lucky that we're part of the fair as well. The Photographers Gallery does show. But one of the things that my team always have been saying to me is that although we went through this incredible photography boom in the 90s with the Dusseldorf School, when everything was super huge in scale, and we are surrounded a little bit with some of those larger works here tonight, the trend has been recently for smaller works, which is, I think, have people just run out of wall space? Or are artists making smaller, more intimate works? And a lot of the works that we'll be showing are much smaller in scale. And we think this is a pretty good trend because
it's a huge relief for dealers.
Yes, storage,
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Not such good news for shippers, but apart from that.
No, and this is, I agree with you completely, and this is the perfect time for your show, Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, you're all saying things I'm so thrilled to hear.
Yeah.
Because
I mean, it's timed perfectly for the moment where...
Somehow. So I'm showing everything. Everything is small. And I've never worked with pieces, normally I'm in that sort of camp. And I've got 16 by 20 inch prints and 11 by 14. We installed today. And the fact that I can lift them all on my own and hang on the wall is so nice. And they're vintage prints. So they were printed during Harold's lifetime, and there's something about them that is so seductive, just the object, you almost can read the silver on the page. And that's not to say that I don't love a contemporary photograph, because I do and own a lot of them. But there's something about the paper and the hand. He was in the darkroom printing most of the stuff we have in the show, and it has like an aura. So I'm thrilled I'm on trend, but I didn't know that I was. So it's great.
And so fascinating to have. What I love about your show is that, as you mentioned, it's in this crazy big beautiful building next to Somerset House, and as Giles was saying, you're showing there, the Photographers Gallery is showing there, and you're bringing a lot of big names or up and coming artists, but you have someone that most people have never heard of.
No, and I didn't. So in 2015, a friend of mine said he was making a documentary on a photographer, and asked me if I would speak to his widow, and I actually said no. I only really try and deal with living artists, because for me, the thrill of what we do is being able to work with artists. I mean, it is the biggest privilege, albeit with a few headaches. And the idea of dealing with an estate just wasn't something I wanted to do, and also going backwards from a collecting standpoint, I felt that if I hadn't heard of him, his estate wouldn't be in the sort of shape that you could bring it to market. And that's to say, were enough images printed in his lifetime? Did he print them himself? Are they all signed? Are they editioned? Or is this woman going to hand me a bunch of negatives and say, go and build a market? So I said no. And then Andy, the director of the film, asked me again. And I said yes. And then in speaking to Judith, Harold's widow, I quickly realized it wasn't those things. And this was a man who had huge success in his early career. So he was sort of a child prodigy with small format photography. This is the 1950s. He's in New York. And he was the youngest artist ever to be collected by MoMA. He was 17, and Steichen bought 3 pieces. Then he said no to Steichen when Steichen asked him to be in the Family of Man show, which was the most important photography show ever. And then he sort of walked away from the scene, and he focused on being an artist and a teacher more than being part of New York. Though again, he had another sellout show twice, once in the late 50s and then in the early 60s. So anyway, my exhibition is about, one, giving voice to this man and celebrating his body of work, which is this wonderfully optimistic, free, happy thing, which I always worry isn't on trend because everyone likes to be a bit, miserable.
Especially,
I didn't say it.
Yeah.
Brett did.
Yeah.
But there is, and actually, in the era that he was shooting, if you think of, not to knock Diane Arbus, but her images, they're beautiful as well, but they are painful and hard. And Harold is the total opposite of that. This was a man who was living life and loving life and literally could look at anything and find beauty, and he does it in a tiny little box, and they're seductive and beautiful, in my opinion.
And how is the condition? What's the condition of the prints, of these vintage prints?
Great question. They're good. So we, part of my due diligence was bringing in an expert, not from Sotheby's, from somewhere else that we won't mention.
Ooh.
I didn't know you then. I didn't know you. Anyway, I did bring in an expert, and we looked through them, and they're good. There are some flaws in some of the prints, and even there are flaws in some of the prints that I chose to put up. I wanted to tell the story more than I wanted to show a perfect print. And again, I think that's part of it, that objectness, and you're looking at this thing that does come from, they are old.
Yep.
The 1950s was a long time ago.
And old prints should have flaws.
Yeah.
Prior to being here at Sotheby's 6 years ago, I worked for 11 years in galleries, and if you saw a vintage print that was in perfect condition, alarm bells went off. And I think it's important just to talk about, and I'm going to direct this question to Giles, or just ask you to explain a little bit the difference between the vintage prints, the contemporary prints, and maybe use someone as Cartier-Bresson, for example, and how different they are, how they look different, the format is different, the way they're signed, because these are, of course, very important questions which you should be considering and asking yourself, and asking a gallerist, asking if you're at their space or at Photo London or here. We're sitting in a room with a lot of large works. These are all contemporary works. Of course, in the other galleries, we have 3 other galleries where you have mainly older works printed by hand. Some may not be vintage, but most of them in the other rooms were not printed so recently. So these are all questions that you really need to consider, and they will have different values. The vintage prints to the contemporary prints. Some dealers talk about modern prints, that sort of period in between. And the same goes for, as a gallery, as I said, you have different price points. It's the same for us in the secondary market. So there's some, correlation between, there's a tier system. Can you just talk us through a little bit?
Yeah. It's both very complicated and very simple. So I'll try and stick with the latter bit.
I think once you get your head around it, it's really easy.
Exactly. So I always refer to this kind of hurdle of knowledge that you've got to kind of deal with before you can get really stuck into collecting photographs. But it's not much of a hurdle, and once you've kind of got it, then it's really easy to go out there and enjoy the market. So we often get asked by people who are brand new to collecting, is this an original? That seems like a perfectly normal question to ask. Of course, the answer is with a photographic print, none of them are an original. The original is the original capture, which is often a negative or a transparency, or these days it's a digital file, which most people don't want to own. So really all you have is the reproduction of that, the print, and its age and its size and its rarity. So these are the things that vary the pricing and collectability of these things. But I just want to ram home, before I get into the details on that, this notion of, so when you're going around here looking at these pictures on the wall, you are buying a photograph, but you're not really. You could go out and buy the book and cut that photograph out. You could go out and buy a calendar and put it on your wall and have the photograph. What you're actually buying is the object, the beautiful, handmade, hopefully, or whatever object. And so that's what we're all about. As well as the image, we're about the object. And that's what photography collecting is about. Carrie used exactly the word that I love to use about these historical objects in particular, which is aura. And when you look at a vintage print printed by Cartier-Bresson, for example, it has this magical aura about it. And it's partly the romance of knowing that it was printed by him and it comes from that time. I don't think many people can actually see this aura, but that is what collectors want. Of course it's what you want. It's why you want the original Tiffany lamp and not the reproduction one you can buy in John Lewis, right? To use an extreme example. And that's our business. So vintage prints, by and large, particularly when we're talking about 20th century photography, or early 20th century photography, were never made to be exhibited or sold or anything. They were normally working prints that were done for publication in a newspaper or a magazine, which is what photographs were for. There are some photographers who did exhibit them, Edward Weston, I suppose, being a great example. So you can buy vintage exhibition prints by some artists. But by and large, these prints were not ever made for sale. And it's a miracle, really, that they're still here, because they used to be chucked away. And so these are working historical objects that, as a sort of a connoisseurial collector, you can get really excited about, because they're really fun. They're dinked, they're have something got a tone to them, you turn them over, they've got inscriptions and stamps on the back. I mean, it's a wonderfully geeky business, but it's really exciting if you get these things out. And actually, that's what you should always do, I think, and Brandy, I'm sure, would endorse this, is when you come to an auction like this or a gallery, you get the guys to take the print out of the frame and look at the object. Of course, it's going to look nice in a mount and a frame, spotlit on a wall, and they do look very nice, Brandy, I have to say. But get them out and have a look at the object, because only then can you really enjoy the thing. Vintage prints, to the right sort of collector, have a huge premium. I don't know whether you would agree with this, but for perhaps an unknown photographer, a vintage print might be worth double a new print. But for someone like Cartier-Bresson, if you have a really true vintage print of one of his great images, it's going to be worth exponentially more than a later print. 10 times, 20 times more.
I'm going to change my whole checklist right now.
As the photography market developed, photographers would make prints for sale in galleries. And actually, that's the bulk of what we deal with. I wish we could deal with more vintage prints, but they're really rare, obviously. And a photographer like Cartier-Bresson in the 80s and 90s got engaged with the art market and made collector's prints. So using negatives he made 30, 40 years before and making new prints of them. Those are known as printed later prints, and that makes up the bulk of the market. What I would say is that I think we're all, even in the gallery, sometimes we struggle. It's difficult to put a print date on these things. But I think, by and large, a good dealer or auction house should be able to give you some indication of when this thing was made, because that's important to know. So we always try and, if we don't know exactly when it was made, put a stab at the period or even the decade, quite frankly, when this object was likely to have been done. And then you get modern prints, essentially, which are what they sound like. They're a photographer doing that, except now. So Cartier-Bresson's printed later prints once were modern prints, and they sort of drift into printed later. And by and large, the value sort of goes down towards the more modern end. But to completely muddle it all up, the vintage print market, for example, for Ansel Adams, one of the great photographers of all time, is fairly weak compared to his later print market, because, of course, when you're buying an Ansel Adams print, most people don't want a little brown square like that. They want a great big epic beautifully made, sweeping cinematic picture. And of course, those are the ones that people tend to go for. So it's not always the rule that vintage is more expensive. I would say probably that it is always the rule that vintage is more special.
And I think, there's going back to size and the importance of size, and I agree with all of you that there's a shift, I think, in people's desire to see and to buy works that are not on this very large scale. And Michael and I were on a panel discussion last week with a collector who's here in the audience, who made an exceptional point about, just because it's bigger doesn't mean it's better, doesn't mean it's more expensive. And the photographer and collector said, one of his favorite works, which is one of the most expensive photographs of all time, is a tiny, tiny contact print of The Swimmer by Cortege that was in the Elton John collection. And, I think it's an interesting point about, again, this, we should all remember, size isn't everything, and small things can be equally as valuable, if not more, depending on the period of when they were made and so forth.
And you can get more of them into your house.
Yes.
That's the other thing.
Well, in general, you can get more photographs because, let's be honest, it's very affordable.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've talked about this before, but I mean, for the price of one moderately good piece of contemporary art, you can build an extraordinary collection of photography, even now, which is a great bonus and benefit to us. And I think actually it's a benefit for the fair too, because people have come. We will present next on Wednesday, Thursday this week, 442 different artists. And within that group, you're going to find some real interesting changes, but you're going to find work which is ranging from maybe £300 to £300,000 or £400,000. So there's really it's a market which you can get into very quickly and very easily. It's very affordable, and you can build a fantastic collection. So I think it's a great place to start.
The only other fly in the ointment, of course, there is the distinction between the contemporary artists who use photography, like Cindy Sherman-Gursky and Richard Prince, who command prices 10 times as much as what we are calling here photography by photographers or photographers by artists. So there's a big distinction. I mean, does it happen in Sotheby's that all those artists get put into contemporary art, and Cindy Sherman would never be shown in this exhibition?
Well, she would, and she has. I think that line is shifting.
Yes,
I think that line
is
fading and moving, and a lot of that is because of I think what is being shown at institutions like yours, what you see at fairs. So we are the secondary market. We exist within the primary market, and we definitely relate to and respond to what's being sold on the primary. And I think a lot of what's being sold on the primary is in response to what people are seeing in the institution. So there's this sort of system and chain that all works together. I mean, I don't know, you probably can't see on the screen, but right behind here is a Thomas roof, which normally, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you would see only in a contemporary sale. You're now seeing these contemporary artists who use photography in a photographic sale. But I think it's important to show we're all interested in, as we've said, we're all interested in the technique and the vintage works, but I think we're all very interested in artists who push the boundaries of photography. So I wouldn't limit when I'm curating my sale and working out what to have in the sale. I don't limit myself to just the older works, or I'm interested in as well in what the contemporary artists are doing. But you're right, there is still a big appetite
A price differential,
and a big price difference.
Yeah. I mean, we make an absolute effort to break that boundary as much as we can. So, for example, last year we had Darren Armand, who we had to persuade to take part in the fair.
He actually didn't want to be in a photography
Exactly.
fair.
I'm an artist. I don't want to be in a photography fair. But actually, he came, he sold very, very well, and that message has been transmitted to many of his peers, all of whom now want to be part of them. So, and we're finding the boundaries are crumbling. And the conversations we have with contemporary galleries are very interesting. And we have Pace taking part in the fair this year. They would have never taken part in a photography fair 5 years ago. So it's an interesting shift that we're looking at. It's fascinating.
No, it's very interesting. I remember when Gagosian first exhibited at Paris Photo, that was a big moment.
Yes.
And it happened when, I'm sure, well, we all remember, I hope some of you had visited Paris Photo years ago when it was in the Carousel du Louvre, under the Louvre, and it was a much more hands-on, sort of dealer, geeky fair. And they moved to the Grand Palais, which is beautiful, and they sort of grew up. And the blue chip galleries noticed, and Gagosian came, and that definitely was a shift for the fair. And I think, and again, at least for our European market, how we looked at and considered collecting photography.
So the other big shift is those contemporary galleries showing classic photography, like Gagosian shows Bailey, Sally Mann, Taryn Simon, of course, who considers herself an artist. So they have the representatives from both areas.
They do. You're right. And it's so interesting that they're catching on to what we've been doing in the photography world. So you can go to many galleries who already have the vintage prints of Eggleston. And then you go to Zorner and you see these lovely later prints, recent prints, but you can go to other photography galleries and really understand that backstory and the history and what made them.
I think they're also, sorry. No, I was very interested to see when I went around Frieze in October that there was hardly any photography at Frieze. And I think that the other reason is that as this market has expanded, all of the photographers and dealers have suddenly seen an opportunity here, which I think has been fading slightly in the contemporary collecting world, is the sort of feedback I get. So we did a show. We represent Joel Sternfeld. We actually now represent him directly, but we originally represented him through a New York gallery called Luring Augustine, who are a very famous, massive, big blue chip gallery in Chelsea. And I didn't think we had a chance in hell of doing a Joel Sternfeld show with them, but I rang them up, as I do, and the director there was like, "Oh, you've got photography collectors?" And we said, yes, and they couldn't have been more interested. And so next time I was in New York, I went there, and they were thrilled that we might be able to sell some Joel Sternfelds to photography collectors. I think they were struggling. And so this has helped enormously.
Yeah, it's interesting that you just check out how many contemporary galleries are doing photography shows this week. Yeah. I mean, we counted there are about 160 satellite events in London during the course of this week. Many of them, all my fault. Yeah, I'm very sorry. I know. I mean, that's exactly the problem, Brandy. There's too much going on. And it's interesting actually. One of the I forget which it was. I think maybe the Telegraph decided that they were going to christen this month Photo London Month. I mean, so we were rather kind of pleased, scared by the idea that we may have to go on for a whole month. Sorry, we're not.
I think there is also something to remember, right? This is a medium that is still in its infancy in some ways, especially if you're comparing it to sculpture and painting and more traditional art forms. And so I think that as with anything that's new, it gets put in a box and put on the side, and people like that because they understand it. And now it's been around for long enough, and you have artists who use it across their disciplines, whether in some occasions you can be a painter and then you can be a photo painter. And we have a few of those now. So I think that that there will be a little bit more of blurring of the lines and people feeling easier about contemporary artists being photographers and photographers being sculptors, and it's all becoming a bit muddier in a good way.
Absolutely. And I think it's, going back to the galleries, the contemporary galleries who represent or are repositioning photographers in a certain way. You see the work with them in the blue chip galleries. You see, go and visit other galleries that show the historical work, come to the auctions, see what else we have here, and again, always keeping in mind collecting photography. And we're going to wrap this up soon, so I want your sort of top tips. I would say, again, you have this gem of a week ahead. It should be a month long because there's so much to do and see. But go around, please ask questions, which sounds so obvious, but I think there's often a fear of, approach, and there'll be someone sitting down at a desk and you don't, but go up, ask them prices, compare, look online. You can access the catalog for all the works here online. You will see a lot of the photographers that we have in our sale in these galleries, in galleries at Photo London. Compare the prices. Compare what type of prints they are. We generally, on the secondary market, will be priced a bit lower than the primary market, but some of those reasons might be that it's a different print. Is it signed? Is it a posthumous print? Is it a lifetime print? So, as Giles said earlier, it sounds like it's all complicated, but once you get the language and understand it, it's very simple, and there are a few things that you need to remember and ask. Go to the photographer's gallery, become a patron, sign up, go to events, educate yourself. So those would be my tips of things to think about when you're collecting, building. Obviously, buy what you like, but educate yourself. Make sure you're not going to waste your money at any of our venues, but just really understand what you're buying and where it fits into the overall photographic market and the wider art market. And of course, everyone has access to ArtNet, so there's no excuse to not having to see, for me on the secondary market, where things have sold, how prices have increased. And it's very interesting, if you look at, for us at our auctions and the works that we sell, they're often the same names: Helmut Newton, Irving Penn, Richard Avedon. These are big photographers who are known globally, who are supported by museums, but there are other up-and-coming photographers and gems, and all of these names, again, can be seen and bought at the fair, at galleries at the fair, or seen at shows at the Photographer's Gallery. I'm looking at the Alex Prager next to the Crudson. You had both shows in the past year of these artists. So again, just to wrap up, what are our sort of top tips for the week ahead and collecting, and what would be your golden nugget of advice?
Okay. British documentary, black and white, from the 80s to the present day is very undervalued. I mean, Chris Killip, Tish Murtha, all those people, really do look at them. Nobody's collecting that. Secondly, please do support young British artists. They really do need your support. They find it very hard to make a living, and if you invest in somebody at this time, they'll always remember you buying their first work, and you can see them everywhere in the fair. And finally, our discussion today has mostly been about Europe and America, and I just want to flag up that, one of the big trends is Japanese photography and African photography. They are so exciting at the moment, and there will be examples at the fair, but also make those, if you're interested in any specific geographical area of the world, you can find everything about that area now, where our next show is Latin American photography. So broaden your horizons. Don't just go for the known British and American axis. It's dominated things for too long, and we have a much greater opportunity now to see things from everywhere in the world. So that'll be my 3 tips.
Excellent. Carrie?
Oh, no. Buy what you love. I mean, that's the best rule of thumb. The person who I worked with first in the art world also used to siphon off a part of my salary, and I'd love him for doing this, but he said once a year you should buy something. And then his next advice was, when you get a raise, you should buy 2 somethings from the one person you love.